the only farmer who read the fine print. When the bank showed up, he was the only one smiling. On the morning when 3 men in suits arrived at the farm with briefcases full of papers, Mr. Arthur was leaning against the barn gate, his pitchfork resting on the ground, smiling. It wasn't the smile of someone who doesn't understand what's happening. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and had been preparing for that day far longer than anyone could imagine. The 3 men got out of the car with serious expressions, dark suits, tight ties, brown leather briefcases in hand. They stopped a few yards away, as if they expected him to back down, as if their arrival alone would be enough to wipe that smile off his face. But Arthur didn't back down. He stood there, in faded denim overalls and a plaid shirt, his worn-out cap on his head, his eyes calm like someone who has seen a lot and is no longer scared by men in suits. The story that brought him to that moment had started almost a year earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon when the Farmers' Co-op in town received a proposal that seemed too good to be true. And when something seems too good to be true, Arthur Harrison had always been the kind of man who stops, takes a deep breath and carefully reads the fine print. The co-op hall was packed that afternoon. The rows of plastic chairs held about 50 local farmers, folks who knew the land by its smell, who could name every type of pest by the shape of a chewed leaf, men and women with calloused hands and practical eyes who rarely wasted time on long meetings. But that day, the proposal being presented was unlike anything they had seen before. The manager's name was Bradley Sterling. He was around 40, hair combed to the side, an easy smile, and a well-modulated voice. He wore a navy blue suit that looked expensive and a watch that caught the ceiling light every time he gestured. He talked about the rural credit line as if he were handing out gifts. Interest rates below market for the first year, an 8-month grace period before payments start, free technical assistance, and the best part, no red tape. "Sign today. The money hits your account in 5 business days," he said, running his hand through his hair and smiling at the audience. The room murmured. Farmers exchanged glances. It was exactly the kind of offer the area needed after 2 years of uneven harvests. Arthur sat in the back, quiet. He was 67, owned a medium-sized farm 5 miles from town, had 2 kids who had already moved away to work elsewhere, and a wife named Martha, who knew him so well that just by looking at the set of his shoulders, she could tell if he was worried or at ease. That afternoon, Arthur's shoulders were tense. When Bradley finished speaking and started handing out the folders with the contracts, most of the farmers already had their pens in hand. Thomas, Arthur's brother-in-law, was one of the first to open the envelope. "Arthur, what do you think?" Thomas whispered, tilting his head to the side. "Let me take it home to read," Arthur replied in a low voice. Thomas let out a short laugh. "You and your habit of reading everything. You heard what he said. Low interest, grace period, no red tape. What more do you need to know?" Arthur didn't answer. He just stared at the closed folder in his hand while the others signed around him. That night, after dinner, Martha cleared the table and went to wash the dishes. Arthur sat in his usual chair, the one closest to the window, turned on the yellow lamplight, and opened the folder. He put on his reading glasses, adjusted himself in the chair, and started reading. It was 42 pages long. He read every single one of them. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit the like button and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks who are just starting out. Now, moving on. The first time he stopped was on page 12. He read the paragraph again. Then he grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and copied the words by hand, just like his father had taught him when he was little and still didn't quite understand what he was reading. Copying by hand helped him understand. It always had. The paragraph said, in small print tucked between 2 longer sections, that after the grace period, the interest rates would be adjusted according to the financial institution's internal index and could range between 4 and 18% per month. Not per year. Per month. Arthur took off his glasses and stared out the window for a moment. Outside, the crickets were chirping. The cornfield swayed gently in the wind. The farm was quiet, as it always was at that hour, and there was something deeply unsettling about all that stillness as he held that paper in his hand. He kept reading. On page 21, he found the second clause that made him stop. In the event of a payment delay exceeding 30 days on any installment, the institution would have the right to initiate a foreclosure process on the agricultural equipment listed as collateral, without the need for prior notification to the debtor. A single month of delay was enough, just 1 month, and the tractor, the harvester, the set of implements that each family had built up over decades could be taken away. But it was on page 34 that Arthur felt a different kind of chill. There was a paragraph that allowed the institution to unilaterally alter the terms of the contract, meaning without having to notify the contractor, in the event of a change in the regional economic scenario. The wording was too vague to be accidental. It was vague enough to serve as a doorway to anything. Martha came into the living room at 11 at night, surprised that the light was still on. "Arthur, aren't you going to bed?" He looked up. She knew that expression. It was the same one he'd had when he found out the neighbor was diverting water from the creek years ago. The expression of someone who had seen something that couldn't be undone. "Martha, I'm not signing this contract," he said. She came closer, looking at the papers spread out on the table. "Why?" He showed her the sections he had marked with the pencil. She read slowly, her face changing color as she moved from one paragraph to the next. "And the others signed this?" Most of them did. Martha sat down slowly in the chair beside him. The two of them were silent for a moment, with the sound of the crickets outside and the papers scattered between them. "Are you going to talk to Thomas?" she asked. "I'll try, but he won't listen to me. You know how he is." "Try anyway." Arthur folded the pages where he had marked the sections, put them in a folder, and went to bed. But he didn't truly sleep that night. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, with that specific weight of someone who knows something that others don't know yet, and isn't sure how to deliver that information without breaking something. The next morning, Arthur went over to Thomas's place before breakfast. Thomas was in the corral when he arrived, tending to the cows with his usual haste, as if the day never had enough time for everything that needed to be done. Thomas was 62, 5 years younger than Arthur, and had been his brother-in-law ever since Arthur married Martha almost 40 years ago. The two had a relationship that was half friendship and half silent rivalry. Thomas was always quicker to make decisions, more confident, more willing to take risks. Arthur was the opposite, and it sometimes annoyed Thomas in a way he couldn't fully hide. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about something regarding this contract," Arthur began. Thomas tossed a bundle of grass to one of the cows without stopping what he was doing. "What is it?" "I read the whole contract last night. There are some clauses in there that I think need to be explained better before you—" "Arthur," Thomas interrupted him with the patience of someone who already knows what's coming. "You've always been like this, always seeing a problem where there isn't one." The manager explained everything at the meeting. "He didn't explain what's on page 12. "What page 12? "The interest rates. After the grace period, the interest can go up to 18% a month, Thomas. Not a year, a month." Thomas paused for a second, then he shook his head. "That's bank talk, technical jargon. The manager said it was below market rate. The first year, and then? And then we renegotiate like everyone does." Arthur stood there looking at his brother-in-law. It was no use insisting. He knew that tone. It was the tone of someone who's already made up their mind and doesn't want to be convinced otherwise, because being convinced otherwise would mean admitting they were wrong to sign without reading. "All right," said Arthur, "but keep a copy of the contract somewhere safe, Thomas. Promise me that, at least." Thomas shrugged. "Of course I'll keep it. Why would I throw it away?" Arthur went back to the farm, walking slowly along the dirt road. Behind him, the sun was starting to peek through the low clouds, painting the fields orange. It was a beautiful morning, the kind of morning that made any worry seem overblown, but Arthur knew that beautiful mornings didn't change what was written on the pages of a contract. That same day, before heading out to the fields, he did something that would only make sense months later. He took the copy of the contract he'd received at the meeting, still unsigned, with all the pages intact and the bank representative's stamp at the bottom of each sheet. He put it inside a manila envelope, wrote the date on the outside with a black pen, and stored it in the back drawer of the office desk, behind a stack of old receipts. Martha saw him putting it away but didn't ask anything. She just watched. The months that followed were a prosperity that hurt to behold. The neighbors who had signed the contract started showing up with new equipment, with pickup trucks that smelled like plastic, with smiles wider than usual. At the farmers' market in Kansas City, the conversations changed tone. People talked about expanding crops, investing in irrigation, planting soy where there used to be only corn. Thomas bought a new tractor. He was so proud of the machine that he spent 2 Sundays in a row washing it in the yard, as if it were his child. Arthur watched all of this and felt a discomfort he couldn't quite name. It wasn't envy. It was something like what you feel when you see someone crossing a bridge you know has a crack in the middle, and you shouted and they didn't hear, and now you can only stand there and hope the weight isn't enough to break it. Martha noticed. "You're sleeping badly again," she said one night in July, as the two of them washed dishes together, which they always did when they needed to talk without looking at each other. "I'm thinking about Thomas, and there's nothing you can do about it now." "I know." "Then stop losing sleep over it." Arthur dried the last cup and hung it on its usual hook. "Martha, if what I think will happen does happen, it's going to be really bad. Not just for Thomas. For a lot of families around here." She turned to him, the dishcloth still in her hand. "And what do you want me to say? That you were right to read before signing?" "No. I want you to tell me I can help when the time comes." She folded the cloth carefully, the way she always did, and placed it on the edge of the sink. "You will," she said simply. It wasn't the kind of answer that solved anything. But it was the kind of answer Arthur needed at that moment, and the two of them knew it. The turn began in September, when the harvest showed that the winter had been drier than expected. It wasn't a complete tragedy, but it was enough to leave margins tight. And tight margins with expensive debt were a dangerous combination. The manager, Bradley Sterling, started showing up more at the farmers' co-op. Not to give presentations or hand out proposals anymore. He showed up more discreetly to have coffee with the co-op president, to talk to farmers in the parking lot, to make the kind of visit that has no set agenda but a very clear purpose. Arthur watched him on one of those visits, from a distance, without Bradley noticing. There was something about the man's behavior that caught his attention. Every time he talked to a farmer, he asked 1 or 2 questions that seemed casual, but weren't. He asked what the estimated value of a certain property was. He asked if anyone had outstanding loans from before the current contract. He asked about equipment, who owned their own harvester and who leased. It was a sweep, done with a smile, with coffee in hand, with that well-placed voice that inspired trust. But it was a sweep. Arthur went home that afternoon with one more piece of the puzzle in place. When the first bills from the second period arrived, with the adjusted interest rates, it was like someone had thrown a stone into a still lake. The impact was immediate and spread in waves. Thomas Miller was the first to look for Arthur. It was a Wednesday afternoon. He showed up without warning, knocked on the back door with his knee because his hands were busy holding a folded paper. Martha opened the door and was surprised to see her brother-in-law's expression, that face she had known for decades, now with a color she had never seen on him. "Is Arthur home?" he asked. "He's in the office. Come in." Thomas walked in. He sat down in the chair by the window without being invited. Arthur appeared from the hallway entrance, saw his brother-in-law, and understood immediately, without needing an explanation. "The bill came," Arthur said. Thomas unfolded the paper with fingers that weren't as steady as usual. "Arthur, this can't be right. This amount can't be what I owe. I borrowed to plant. I paid for the seed, I paid for the fertilizer, I paid for the fuel. And now they want 3 times that back?" Arthur moved closer and looked at the paper. The numbers were high, too high for a harvest that had yielded less than expected. "Sit here," Arthur said. They went to the kitchen table. Martha, without saying a word, placed 2 coffees on the table and quietly stepped away. Arthur went to the desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out the brown envelope with the date written on it. He placed it on the table next to Thomas's bill. "I kept the version of the contract they presented at the meeting before anyone signed," he said. "Now bring me the copy you signed." Thomas looked at his brother-in-law with an expression that mixed confusion and something close to hope. "Why did you keep that?" "Because I didn't trust it. And when you don't trust something, you keep the proof of what was offered." Thomas went to get his copy of the contract early the next morning. He brought it in a plastic folder with a rubber band around it, the way he kept important documents. The two of them sat at Arthur's table with both versions open side by side and began to compare. It was a long morning. At first, the differences seemed small. A word swapped here, a phrase moved there. But as they went page by page, the differences grew. In the version presented at the meeting, the clause about interest rate adjustments had a cap. In the version signed by Thomas, the cap was gone. In the version presented, the deadline for notification before any foreclosure process was 90 days. In the signed version, that deadline had dropped to 30. And there was more. In 3 different paragraphs, small excerpts that seemed to have been inserted later, with slightly different language from the surrounding sentences, as if they were patches made by another hand. Arthur pointed to one of those excerpts. "This paragraph wasn't here," he said. "I read these pages 4 times. This excerpt didn't exist in the version they showed us." Thomas stared at the paper for a long time without saying anything. "So they changed the contract after we signed it?" "Not after, before. They showed one version, but had us sign another." The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas got up and walked to the window. He stood with his back turned for almost a minute. When he turned around, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. "What do we do?" Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit the like button, and especially subscribe to the channel. That really helps us who are just starting out. Now back to the story. Arthur had thought about this. He had stayed up thinking about it more than one night, anticipating the moment when his brother-in-law would knock on his door with exactly that bill in his hand. And he had come to a conclusion. You need a lawyer, someone who understands this. But before you go to any lawyer, I want you to talk to Sarah. Sarah was Thomas's oldest daughter. She was 34, had studied business administration in a bigger city, worked for a few years in accounting offices, and had returned to the area 2 years ago to help her father organize the farm's accounts after her mother fell ill. She was a sharp-minded young woman, an attentive reader, and had a healthy suspicion of business deals. "Sarah's at my place this week," said Thomas. "But what can she do?" "She'll understand these contracts better than any of us, and she'll know what to look for before going to the lawyer." Sarah read both versions of the contract in a single afternoon, sitting at Arthur's kitchen table with a notebook beside her. She was the type who underlined as she read, who wrote questions in the margins, who went back to previous pages when something didn't add up. Arthur stayed in the living room talking with Martha so as not to interrupt. When Sarah finished, she came into the living room with the notebook in her hand and a look on her face that Arthur recognized right away. It was the same look he'd had that Tuesday night with the lamp on when he reached page 12. "Uncle Arthur, there are differences in 6 different points between the 2 contracts," she said, opening the notebook. "3 of them are minor, but 3 are very serious, and there's something I need to check because if I'm right, it's much worse than it seems." "What do you need to check?" "I need to go to the county recorder's office tomorrow morning. Can you drop me off there?" "I'll take you," said Arthur without hesitating. At the county recorder's office, Sarah asked to check the filing records related to 3 properties she had listed, those of the farmers with the highest debts according to conversations her father had had with the neighbors. The clerk at the recorder's office looked at her with a slightly surprised expression, went to the files, and came back with a stack of papers. Sarah sat down in the waiting chair and started flipping through them. Arthur stood beside her, watching. She found what she was looking for on the 3rd page. The bank had filed pre-foreclosure documents on 2 of the 3 properties, without the families having received any notification. No notice, no letter, no visit, simply filed at the recorder's office as if it were a routine procedure. Sarah closed the papers slowly. She turned to Arthur. "They can't do that," she said in a low voice. "The contract, even the modified one, requires formal notification before any action like this. How much time do the families have before this becomes a real problem?" It depends on what they file next, but it's not much time. Weeks, maybe. Arthur glanced at the clock on the wall of the county recorder's office. It was 10:30 in the morning. There was a lot of work to do before sundown. The lawyer who worked in the nearest city was named Howard Vance. He was a man of about 55, with neatly cut grey hair, round reading glasses, and the specific patience of someone who had spent decades listening to complicated stories without letting any of them shake him. He saw clients in the office he shared with a colleague in a room above a pharmacy, and he received clients from the area once a week, on Wednesdays. Thomas and Sarah Miller went to see him the following Wednesday, with both versions of the contract, the copies from the recorder's office, and the notebook with Sarah's notes. Howard was quiet for a long time, reading the documents with the concentration of someone who didn't just read, but absorbed. When he finished, he took off his glasses and cleaned them with a soft cloth he pulled from his pocket. "How many families signed this contract?" he asked. 43, said Thomas. "And do you have the original version presented at the meeting, with the representative's stamp?" "Yes," said Sarah. "My Uncle Arthur kept it." Howard put his glasses back on and opened Sarah's notebook, looking at the notes. "This material is enough to challenge every contract. The unilateral changes without notice constitute a serious irregularity. The pre-foreclosure filing without notification is another serious problem." He closed the notebook slowly. "But I need you to bring me more. I need every affected family to bring me a copy of the contract they signed. I need to compare them all with the original version that Mr. Arthur kept. If the changes follow a pattern, that changes everything." "And while we gather that, are the families safe?" asked Sarah. Howard folded his hands on the table. "For now, yes. But it needs to be fast. If they move forward with the foreclosure processes before we file any request, it becomes a harder path to reverse." Thomas and Sarah left the office with a to-do list that seemed too big to be done in a short time. In the car, Sarah looked at her father. "You need to talk to Arthur today." "I know," said Thomas, looking at the road. There was a different weight in his voice now, a weight Sarah recognized. It was the weight of someone starting to understand that they had ignored a warning and were only now grasping the scale of what they could have prevented. Arthur learned about everything that same afternoon. Martha stood in the kitchen doorway listening as Thomas and Sarah told the story, and she said nothing while they spoke. But when Thomas finished, she went to the pantry and came back with a box of cookies she had bought the day before. It was her way of saying this was serious enough to deserve cookies. "We need to talk to the families," said Arthur, "one by one if we have to." 43 families, Sarah reminded him. "I know how many there are." He took a cookie and broke it in half without eating it. "Start with the closest ones, Hank, the Vance family, Widow Mabel, who planted with her youngest son. Those 3 have the largest properties and the highest chance of having been filed against." Sarah opened her notebook and started writing. "And what do we tell them?" asked Thomas. "The truth." Arthur finally put the piece of cookie in his mouth and chewed slowly. "That they signed a different contract than the one presented. That there are irregularities that can be challenged. And that the lawyer needs the copies to act. Some will panic. Some will, that's why you and Sarah are coming with me. You, because they trust you. Sarah, because she understands the documents and can explain things without scaring anyone more than necessary." Martha came back from the kitchen with a tray of coffee. "I'm going too," she said simply, setting the coffees on the table. The 3 of them looked at her. "Martha," Arthur began, "I've known the women in these families since before you knew their names," she said, sitting down. "When you go talk to Hank, his wife, Mrs. Gladys, is going to be right there, and Mrs. Gladys will trust me more than she'll trust any of you." No one could argue with that. In the weeks that followed, Arthur, Martha, Thomas, and Sarah traveled across the properties in the area like 4 people on a mission no one had asked for, but no one could ignore. They walked when the distance was short and drove when they had to. They sat at each family's table, the way you sit in the home of someone you've known a long time, without formality but with care. In some homes they were welcomed. Mrs. Gladys, Hank's wife, cried when she understood what the documents meant, but then she wiped her eyes and said she wanted to help gather the neighbors' papers. In other homes, the reception was colder. At the home of the brothers Cliff and Dale Harper, who owned a property next to Arthur's, and had always been the suspicious type, the conversation was difficult. "With all due respect, Mr. Arthur," said Cliff, a lean man over 60 with hands marked by hard labor, "you didn't sign the contract, so you don't have a problem. Why are you getting involved in other people's problems?" Arthur looked at him without flinching. "Because those other people are my neighbors, and because if the 3 biggest producers in the area lose their equipment, the price of leasing will go up for everyone. Your problem is everyone's problem, Cliff." Cliff stayed quiet. Dale, who was standing at the back of the room listening, took a step forward. "And this lawyer, how much does he charge?" "He'll talk to everyone before setting any fees," said Sarah, "and he's already said he'll assess each case individually." Dale and Cliff exchanged looks. Then Cliff went to the dresser drawer, took out a blue folder, and placed it on the table. "This is our copy," he said. "Take it." But not everything went that smoothly. On some properties, the news Arthur and his family brought arrived at a time of such tension that the reaction wasn't relief, but resistance. There were families that had already started selling livestock to cover overdue payments, families already in direct negotiations with the manager, Bradley, and who felt that any new move could mess up what they were trying to solve on their own. One Thursday afternoon, when they went to visit the Sullivan family, who lived on a farm 12 miles from Kansas City, the head of the family, a man named Grant, opened the door and didn't invite them in. "I don't want any trouble," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm already talking to the manager. He told me he has a renegotiation proposal." "Grant, that renegotiation is individual," said Thomas. "If you accept it separately from the others, you're out of the group. And if you're out of the group, the strength we have to challenge that contract gets weaker. You all don't have anything guaranteed yet. The lawyer, the documents, fine. But what about in the meantime? While this whole process drags on, I'm in debt. I've got equipment that could be taken away. I've got a family to support." Arthur understood. "Listen, Grant, I didn't come here to tell you what to do. I came to show you what I found. You decide what to do with it." He pulled a folded sheet from his back pocket, where he had listed in clear handwriting the irregularities found in the contracts, with the corresponding page numbers. He held it out to Grant. "Read this. If after reading it, you still want to accept their offer, I respect that. But read it first." Grant took the paper without saying a word. He closed the door. 2 days later, he showed up at Arthur's door with a copy of the contract in hand. But it was during that same period that Bradley Sterling realized what was happening. He was too sharp not to notice the shift in behavior during conversations at the co-op, the way some farmers started dodging his questions, the way certain meetings in the parking lot ended quicker than before. Something was moving behind the scenes, and he knew that when rural communities started moving in silence, there was always someone at the center. It didn't take long for Arthur's name to reach his ears, and when it did, Bradley used the only weapon he had without needing papers or documents. He started spreading a story. It was a simple story, calculated to make sense to those who didn't know Arthur up close. Bradley mentioned in conversations here and there that he had looked up the property records for the area, and that Arthur Harrison's farm had a pending land regularization issue. He didn't say it directly. He said it offhand, like someone commenting on something they'd heard, like someone who was just concerned. "I heard Mr. Arthur's land has some old pending issues. Maybe that's why he didn't want to sign anything. Not that it's his fault, but..." It was a lie. Arthur's farm had been fully regularized for decades, but a lie spread carefully in a small community doesn't need to be true to work. It just needs to be doubtful enough for people to start wondering. Arthur noticed the change in 3 days. The first sign was at the town market, when Cliff passed by him without saying hello. It wasn't a big deal. Cliff simply didn't lift his head when they crossed paths, and that wasn't Cliff's way. The second sign was a conversation Martha had with Hank's wife, Mrs. Gladys. Gladys called one afternoon, not her usual self, and asked with a strange hesitation if Arthur's farm name was really clear on the documents. Martha took a moment to answer. "Mrs. Gladys, we've had the deed to the land since 1982. Everything's in order. Why are you asking?" A silence. "I heard something at the bakery this week. Probably nothing." Martha hung up the phone and went to Arthur, who was in the barn checking the machinery. "Arthur, someone's spreading lies about our land." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "I already suspected it. And what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the red tractor parked against the barn wall, the same one he'd had for 22 years, which he knew every detail of, and which had never belonged to anyone but him. "I'm going to do what I've always done when someone makes up stories about what's mine. I'm going to show the documents." That same afternoon, Arthur went to the county recorder's office with Martha. He requested an updated certificate of the property's status, with all records, no pending issues, with that day's date. The clerk processed the request in what felt like an eternity to the two of them, sitting on the waiting benches with their hands clasped. The certificate came back clean, as it always had. Arthur made 6 certified copies and handed them out to the families he knew had heard the rumor. It wasn't done in anger. It was done with the calm of someone who has nothing to hide and knows that documents speak louder than rumors. Cliff showed up at his door the next morning, hat in hand. "I should have had better sense, Mr. Arthur. Forgive me." "Already forgiven, Cliff. Now bring me another copy of your contract. Sarah wants to compare a few lines." The story of the rumor reached the lawyer Howard Vance when he came to the area the following Wednesday. Sarah was the one who told him, as they were going over documents on the table. Howard listened in silence. Then he said, "That's good." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "How is that good?" "Because when the other side starts pulling moves like that, it means they know they're at a disadvantage. They know what you've got. And they're afraid." Arthur, who was sitting at the back of the room, crossed his arms. "So let's move while their fear is still bigger than ours." Howard organized the documents in his folder. "I already have enough material to file the motion to suspend the proceedings, but I need another week to organize everything clearly." He looked at Sarah. "Can you send me a table comparing the clauses from the contracts you collected?" "I'm already putting it together," said Sarah. "When?" "Tomorrow afternoon." Howard nodded. "Good. Let's act fast." But the week that followed was the hardest of all. Bradley Sterling, realizing that the collective action was moving forward despite everything, changed his strategy. He stopped trying to discredit Arthur and started going directly after the weakest links in the group. He approached individually the farmers with the highest debts and the most urgent situations. He showed up in person at some farms by car, folder in hand, and a cheerful smile, offering a generous renegotiation to anyone who dropped out of the collective lawsuit before it went further. The offer was simple and tempting: a 40% reduction on the total debt, a new 2-year payment term, and immediate removal of any restrictions or records at the county recorder's office. All they had to do was sign a simple term giving up any joint action and stating that there was no irregularity in the original contract. 3 families accepted. When the news reached Arthur, he felt as if the ground had jolted beneath him. Not because 3 fewer families changed the legal basis of the case. Sarah and Howard had already confirmed that the case remained solid with the number of contracts they had. The problem was different, and it took Arthur a while to put a name to it inside himself. The problem was that those families had needed help, and it hadn't been possible to give them a quick enough solution. And there was something about seeing people choose the easy way out, not because they were weak, but because they were exhausted, that weighed on him in a way he simply couldn't ignore. Martha found him sitting on the porch one night, alone, staring at the crops in the dark. "You're blaming yourself," she said, sitting down beside him. He didn't answer right away. "I should have acted faster at the start. When I read that contract that night, I should have gone door to door the next day. And if you had, would Thomas have listened to you?" "No, but maybe some others would have." Martha was silent for a moment. Then, "Arthur, you can't be responsible for the choices other people make with information you tried to give them. I know that. But it still weighs on you." "It does." She placed her hand over his. "That's because you're the kind of man who truly cares, and that kind of man always ends up carrying more than he should." They sat there together on the porch without another word, listening to the sounds of the night and the wind passing through the cornfield. The hardest blow came on a Monday afternoon, 2 days before Howard intended to file the motion to suspend. Bradley showed up at Thomas's farm. He didn't send word, didn't call. He simply parked his car at the entrance, got out with his folder, and asked to speak with Thomas in private. Thomas, surprised by the visit, let him in. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Bradley brought a different offer than the others. It wasn't for Thomas's family in general. It was specifically for him. Full debt settlement with a 50% discount, immediate removal of all records at the county recorder's office, and a new interest-free term for the remainder. An offer that, on paper, looked much better than anything the class action lawsuit could offer in a reasonable time. The only condition was that Thomas sign a document stating there were no irregularities in the contract, and that he formally remove Arthur from any negotiation on behalf of the group. Thomas stared at the papers for a long time. Bradley left, leaving the proposal on the table with a 24-hour deadline for a response. Thomas spent the entire afternoon pacing back and forth inside the house. Sarah went to him at the beginning of the evening and found her father with the proposal in hand, sitting at the table, the pen beside it but still untouched. "Dad." Thomas looked up. "Daughter, I don't know what to do." Sarah sat down beside him. She looked at the papers without touching them. "Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking about the new tractor I bought. I'm thinking about the debt I signed without reading. I'm thinking that I ignored Arthur when he warned me, and now I'm here with this paper in my hand because of it." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "I'm thinking that maybe I deserve to go through this." "Nobody deserves to be deceived, Dad. I wasn't deceived, I was careless." "Those two things can happen at the same time." Thomas was silent. "If I sign this," he said slowly, "I turn my back on Arthur." "Yes." "After everything he's done, after he kept that document, visited every family, put up with the rumors without complaining about anyone." Sarah said nothing. She let the silence do its work. Thomas picked up the proposal, folded it, and placed it back in the folder he had taken it from. He closed the folder. "Early tomorrow morning I'm going to Arthur's house to tell him what happened." Sarah put her hand on her father's shoulder. "I know it was hard," she said. "The hard part was me ignoring him back in March," Thomas replied, getting up from his chair. "This here was just the easy part." Thomas knocked on Arthur's door at 6:30 the next morning, before the sun was fully in the sky. Martha opened it, saw his expression, and called for Arthur without asking a thing. Arthur listened to everything while sitting at the table, his coffee still hot in front of him. When Thomas finished, Arthur was silent for a moment, looking at his cup. "You did the right thing, Thomas." "I don't know if I did, but I did what I could." Arthur stood up and extended his hand to his brother-in-law. Thomas looked at the outstretched hand, stood up, and shook it. They stayed like that for a second longer than a normal handshake usually lasts. "Now we call Howard," Arthur said. Howard took the call that same morning. When he learned of Bradley's maneuver with Thomas, he was silent for a few seconds. "They're desperate," he said. "And when the other side is desperate 2 days before a hearing, that means something." "What?" asked Sarah, who was also on the call. "That they know what you have is enough." A pause. "I'll file it today. I'm not waiting another 2 days." Sarah closed her eyes in relief. She opened them again and looked at her father. Thomas had stepped outside, his back to the window, looking at the farm. She went to him. "Howard is going to file it today," she said. Thomas nodded slowly. "Thomas," she called. He turned. "You did the right thing." He smiled, but it was a smile that carried weight. The kind of smile you learn to make when you're relieved and ashamed at the same time. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and hit the like button and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. On the morning Howard filed the motion for suspension, the Farmers' Co-op buzzed with rumors. The news spread quickly, the way news travels in small communities, passing from one mouth to another ear and arriving transformed, exaggerated, distorted. There were those who said the bank was closing. Some said all the contracts had been voided automatically. Some said Arthur Harrison had sued the manager personally. None of it was true. But the rumors served a specific purpose that Arthur noticed. They left Bradley Sterling unsure of exactly how much of the real situation people knew. Bradley reacted the only way he had left. He called for a meeting at the Farmers' Co-op. It was a Friday afternoon. The room was fuller than any recent meeting had been. There were farmers standing along the walls because there weren't enough chairs. There were women who had come with their husbands, which was unusual and significant. There were young people who weren't members of the co-op, but lived in the area and had an interest in what happened. Bradley arrived with 2 colleagues, both in suits. He placed papers on the front table and began speaking in his usual tone of voice, the same reassuring cadence that had convinced many people to sign without reading. He said there were misunderstandings. He said the bank was open to dialogue. He said the contract clauses were standard in the market and that any farmer with questions could contact management for clarification. Arthur was at the back of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, listening. When Bradley paused to catch his breath, Arthur signaled to Sarah Miller, who was nearby with a folder. She took out 2 sets of stapled sheets from the folder, each with 18 pages, and began distributing them among the farmers sitting in the rows. They were copies of the 2 contracts, placed side by side with the differences highlighted in red with a marker pen. A murmur ran through the room immediately. Bradley realized what was happening. He tried to speak again. "If anyone has specific questions about the contract," he began. "I do," said Mrs. Gladys, sitting in the 3rd row, holding the sheet in her hand with her glasses on her nose. "This paragraph here, on page 12 of the version we signed, that same paragraph doesn't exist in the version you presented at the meeting. Can someone explain to me why?" Silence. Bradley opened his mouth. "That kind of technical question needs to be carefully analyzed outside the context of a meeting like this." "This is the version I signed," said Hank, lifting the sheet. "And this is the version you showed us before we signed. Can someone tell me who changed the paragraph and when?" More silence. Bradley looked at his 2 colleagues in suits. One of them said something quietly. Bradley nodded slightly. "We need time to verify the document versions," said Bradley, his voice having lost much of its reassuring cadence. "We'll schedule individual meetings with each family to—" "We already have a lawyer," said Cliff Harper from the 5th row. "The request for suspension has already been filed." The filing number fell into the room like a stone. Bradley didn't answer. He looked at Arthur, who was still at the back, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. And for the first time since this whole story had begun, the smile that had been on Bradley Sterling's face completely vanished. Arthur said nothing. He didn't need to. The week that followed was one of strategic silence from both sides. Howard Vance announced that the hearing had been scheduled for the last Thursday of the month. There were 12 days of waiting, 12 days in which each affected family woke up with the same weight, checked the mail with a heavy heart, and tried to keep the farm routine running despite everything. Arthur used those days to do what he knew how to do. He woke up early, went to the farm, took care of what needed to be done, came back for lunch, rested for an hour, went back to work. Martha made coffee at 5:30 and left it hot on the table for when he came down. It was a routine that had lasted over 40 years, and there was something comforting about keeping that routine exactly the same while everything around it was in motion. But there were nights when sleep wouldn't come. On one of those nights, Martha woke up to the sound of a chair being dragged across the office floor. She put on her robe and went in there. Arthur was sitting with the lamp on, staring at the stack of documents he had accumulated over the past few months. The copies of the contracts, Sarah's notes, the certificates from the county recorder's office, the sheets with the comparisons. "You okay?" she asked from the doorway. "I'm thinking about a detail I don't think I ever told Howard about." She walked in and sat in the chair beside him. "What detail?" At the meeting, when Bradley handed out the envelopes, all the envelopes were handed out at the same time, but the contract inside my envelope had the representative's stamp on every page. He picked up the manila folder at the bottom of the stack. If the contract they presented was identical to the one people signed, why did their representative stamp every page of mine, including the pages where the clauses were later changed? Martha looked at the pages he was opening. Because the stamp is proof that that version was presented. If they changed the contract afterward, their stamp on a different version proves there was an alteration. Arthur looked at her. Exactly. Their representative accidentally stamped the evidence against them. Martha was quiet for a second. You need to talk to Howard first thing tomorrow. That's what I'll do. Howard received the information with his usual calm, but there was something different in his tone of voice when he said, "This is significant, Mr. Arthur. The stamp on distinct versions establishes, in a documented way, that there were two different versions of the contract, and that the stamped version predates the alterations. This seals the argument. Does it make the case stronger? The case was already solid, but this eliminates any doubt about the narrative that the clauses were always that way, and there was just a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding. There was a substitution." Arthur breathed. "So we're going into the hearing with this. With this and everything else. It'll be enough." There was a certainty in Howard's tone that Arthur carried with him in the following days, as if it was something tangible he could keep in his pocket. The hearing was on a Thursday morning, in a room at the courthouse in the neighboring town. The room had wooden chairs, tall windows, and the serious lighting of those places that make people speak lower than usual. Arthur and Martha arrived together, by car, with Thomas and Sarah Miller. Howard was already there, organizing the documents on the table. There were also representatives from 12 other families, scattered among the chairs, with expressions ranging from weariness to cautious hope. The bank was represented by 2 lawyers Arthur had never seen before. Bradley Sterling didn't show up. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours. Howard presented the documents in order. First, the original version of the contract with the representative's stamps. Then, the version signed by the farmers, with the alterations marked. Then, the certificates from the county recorder's office proving the pre-foreclosure filings without notification. Then, the table Sarah had prepared, comparing clause by clause across 41 contracts. The bank's lawyers contested what they could. They said the version differences could be attributed to routine technical adjustments. They said the filings at the county recorder's office were standard precautionary measures. They said any confusion could be resolved through direct renegotiation. The judge listened to everything with the specific patience of someone who had seen many parties try to explain the inexplicable. At the end of 3 hours, he ordered the immediate suspension of all ongoing proceedings related to the contracts in question, and ordered a complete review of each contract in light of the identified changes. It wasn't a final victory. It was the beginning of a process that would still take time. But it was the first real, concrete, documented victory. When they left the room, the sun was high outside. There was a gentle breeze moving the trees across the street. Mrs. Gladys, who had come along with Hank, hugged Mrs. Martha on the sidewalk without saying a word, and the two of them stayed like that for a moment that lasted longer than courtesy hugs usually do. Thomas Miller stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, staring at nothing in particular. "Is it over?" he asked Sarah. "Not yet, but the hardest part is over." Thomas nodded. "I needed to ask even though I knew the answer." Sarah smiled. "I know, Dad." Arthur stood to the side, watching. Martha came up to him and stood beside him, without saying a word, because after 40 years of marriage, there were moments that didn't need words. Howard came over to Arthur before leaving. "I'll prepare the documentation for the next phase. It might take a few more months, but the path is open." "How long?" "Hard to say. But what matters is that they can't move forward while this process is ongoing. The families are protected now." Arthur extended his hand. Howard shook it. "Thank you, Counselor." "The credit isn't mine, Mr. Arthur. You kept the right document at the right time. Without that envelope, we wouldn't have the case we have." The following months were a slow but steady motion. The process moved forward through the necessary steps, with back and forths that tested everyone's patience. There were weeks when nothing visible happened, and that lack of news was hard to bear for families living under the weight of an uncertainty that didn't disappear overnight. Arthur handled that period the only way he knew how to handle slow things: by working. Every day the farm, every day the same routine, every night the coffee that Mrs. Martha let cool while he checked the new documents Howard sent via message through Sarah. There were moments when he wondered if he had been right to involve so many people in something he wasn't sure how would end. There were nights when the weight of being at the center of something bigger than himself felt too heavy for a 67-year-old man who just wanted to tend his own land. One Sunday afternoon, as the sun set over the farm, Arthur was sitting on the porch when he heard a car noise at the gate. He recognized Cliff Harper's vehicle before the engine even turned off. Cliff got out carrying a glass jar that Arthur recognized as guava jam. Cliff's wife always made it when the guava tree bore fruit. "My wife sent it," Cliff said, handing over the jar. "She said Mrs. Martha likes it." "Mrs. Martha will be happy. Come in." "No thanks, just came to drop it off." Cliff stood for a second with his hat in his hand, looking at the ground. "Arthur, I wanted to tell you something." "Go ahead." "That week, when I passed you at the market without saying hello." He paused. "I shouldn't have done that." Arthur was silent for a second. "Cliff, you already apologized." "I know, but a verbal apology is one thing. I wanted you to know I truly regretted it." He looked up. "My wife said a man who acted the way you did didn't deserve that." Arthur looked at him. "Your wife is wise." Cliff let out a short laugh. "I know. That's why I've been married to her for 38 years. They shook hands. Cliff got back in the car. "Mrs. Martha appeared at the door as the car drove off, saw the jar of jam. "Was that Cliff?" "Yeah. Brought his jam. Said you like it." She picked up the jar and examined it. "Guava jelly." A smile. "Benicio's wife really knows how to make this right." "Benicio isn't as bad as he seems when you've known him long enough." Martha looked at him with a smile that was half ironic and half affectionate at the same time. "You and your ability to see the good in people, even when they ignore you at the market." "I learned it from someone," he said. "Who?" "You." She made a sound that was half laugh and half reproach and went back inside with the jelly. The final resolution came on a Monday, almost 5 months after the hearing. Howard called early, before 7 in the morning, which was unusual enough for Mr. Arthur to know it was important, even before he answered. "The bank accepted the deal," Howard said without preamble. "Full review of all contracts with a return to the original clauses. Cancellation of all filings at the county recorder's office, and compensation for expenses generated by the improper proceedings." Mr. Arthur was silent for a moment. "All the contracts, all 41 that are in the process, including those of the 3 families that had accepted the individual proposal. The decision of the agreement includes a retroactive review of the terms for them as well." Mr. Arthur let out the air slowly. "When was it decided?" "Yesterday afternoon. Their representatives signed the agreement at 4 o'clock. I signed as the group's representative at 4:30. A pause. "Do you have a pen nearby?" "I do." "Write down a number. Tomorrow morning, 3 representatives from the bank will show up at your farm to present the contract review document. You'll need to sign as one of the affected farmers. There's no rush. You can read it first." Mr. Arthur smiled, once, very softly. "I always read first." Howard let out a discreet laugh on the other end of the line. "I know. That's why we are where we are." The next morning, Mr. Arthur was leaning on the barn gate with the pitchfork resting on the ground when the black car came down the dirt road. A dark sedan that stopped a few feet from the gate. 3 men got out. Dark suits, tight ties, tan leather briefcases in their hands. Mr. Arthur watched them approach with his usual calm eyes. They stopped. They looked at that man in denim overalls, a plaid shirt, and a worn-out cap who hadn't backed down an inch at their arrival. What the man had on his face wasn't arrogance. It wasn't provocation. It was simply the specific smile of someone who had prepared for a long time, for a moment he knew would come. The representative leading the group opened the briefcase and took out the documents. "Good morning, Mr. Arthur. We've come to bring the contract review document for—" "I know why you're here," said Mr. Arthur, with his usual calm. "Give it here." He took the documents. He pulled his glasses from his pocket, put them on, began to read. The 3 men waited. The morning sun shone from the side, lighting up the red tractor behind Mr. Arthur. the metal barn, the crop stretching beyond the gate in all directions. Mr. Arthur read each page. When he finished, he looked at the three men. "It's correct," he said. "Where do I sign?" The representative pointed to the line with his finger. Mr. Arthur signed calmly, returned the pen, and tucked his copy into the pocket of his overalls. "Is there anything else you need?" he asked. The three exchanged a slight glance. "No," said the representative. "Everything is closed." "Well, good morning to you." The three got back into the car. Mr. Arthur stayed where he was, leaning on the gate with the pitchfork on the ground, watching the dark sedan turn on the dirt road and disappear among the trees. Martha appeared at the back door of the house, hearing the sound of the car fading away. "Is it over?" she called from the door. Mr. Arthur turned to her. "It's over." She disappeared for a moment and returned with 2 glasses of lemonade she had made early that morning, even before the men arrived, as if she knew exactly what that morning called for. They went out to the porch. They sat in their usual 2 chairs side by side, glasses in hand, looking out at the fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sun was still low, painting the tips of the leaves in gold. A gentle breeze moved the rows of plants in a slow, steady ripple, the way it had always moved, long before any bank had shown up in the neighboring city with a generous offer and would keep moving when all this was just a story told at the dinner table. "Did you know it would end like this?" Martha asked. Arthur thought for a moment. "I knew it could end like this. That's not the same thing." "What's the difference?" "Knowing something is possible is different from knowing it will happen. In between those 2 things is everything we went through these months." Martha gently swirled her glass. "Good thing you read the fine print." "Good thing you didn't let me throw the contract away that night," he replied. She smiled at the horizon. "I didn't even know what it was about that night." "I know, but you stayed up with me anyway." They were quiet for a while. The sound of the fields, the birds returning with the day, the smell of damp earth that the morning always brought. Thomas called at 9 in the morning. Arthur answered, still on the porch. "Arthur, the lawyer called me. Did you see?" "I saw. The men were already here." A pause on the other end of the line. "It's over then." "It's over." Another pause, longer. "I need to tell you something, Arthur." "You don't have to, Thomas." "Yes, I do." His brother-in-law's voice was different, less rushed than usual, less defensive. "You warned me back in March. I didn't listen, not out of stupidity. I listened and didn't want to believe it because it was easier not to. And after that, you didn't keep reminding me of the warning. You didn't have that 'I told you so' look. You didn't treat me differently. You just kept helping." Arthur was silent. "I haven't forgotten that," Thomas went on, "and I won't forget it." Thomas. "What?" "Next time I show you a contract, will you read it?" A pause. Then Thomas let out a laugh, a short, genuine laugh, the kind that comes when someone is truly laughing and at the same time realizing they are truly relieved. "I will read it," he said. "You can bet I will read it." Arthur hung up the phone. He put it in his overalls pocket. Martha watched him from beside him. "Is Thomas okay?" she asked. "He's fine." Arthur leaned back in his porch chair and closed his eyes for a second to feel the sun on his face. "He's fine." That afternoon, Sarah stopped by the farm before heading back to the city where she lived. She came in through the back door like someone visiting family, grabbed a cookie from the plate on the table, sat down. "I came to say goodbye," she said. "I'm going back to work, but I'll visit more often than before." Martha poured her coffee without asking. "You'll be missed," Martha said. "You know I'll come back." "I know, but until you do, it still feels like missing you." Sarah looked at Arthur. "Uncle Arthur, I wanted to ask you something." "Go ahead." "That night in March, when you read the whole contract and found out what was in it, did you think about doing nothing, just not signing and leaving it alone?" Arthur held the cup for a moment. "I did, for about 5 minutes." "And what made you change your mind?" He set the cup on the table. "Thomas. I thought about Thomas and the families around here. I thought that if something went wrong, and I knew about it beforehand, I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror afterward, Sarah nodded slowly. "And can you look at yourself in the mirror now?" He smiled. "I can. With the knowledge that I did what I could do, and that the people here, in the end, made the right choice together." A pause. "That's the most anyone can do, Sarah." She was silent for a moment. "My father told me something yesterday," she said. "He said that since he can remember you, you've always been the kind of man who stops and reads before deciding. He said that when he was younger, he thought that was weakness, that he thought it was fear or mistrust or a lack of faith in people. And now? Now he said he understands it's respect. Respect for what you put your name on." Arthur looked out the window. Outside, the afternoon sun was setting softly over the crops. "Your father is stubborn," he said. "But he learns." Sarah smiled. "It runs in the family." Martha let out a laugh at the sink. "From his side of the family, at least," she said without looking back. The three of them laughed, a laugh that was light and needed no explanation. 3 weeks later, there was a meeting at the farmers' co-op. This time, no bank, no manager, no men in suits. It was a meeting of the farmers themselves, called by the co-op president, to decide on the next steps after everything that had happened. The hall was full again, but with a different atmosphere than last time. There was less anxiety in the air, and more of something Arthur could only describe as sobriety, the kind of posture people adopt after going through a situation that teaches you something real. The co-op president opened the meeting. He talked about the closed case, the settlement, the contract review. Then he opened the floor to anyone who wanted to speak. Several farmers spoke. They talked about what they had felt during those months, about the fear, about the shame some felt for not having read the papers they signed, about the relief that came with the final decision. When it was Arthur's turn to speak, he was silent for a second before standing up. "I won't talk much," he said. "I'll just say one thing because I think it's the only thing worth taking away from this." The room went quiet. "Anyone who comes to you with a generous offer and asks you to sign fast, be suspicious. Not because every offer is dishonest, but because any honest offer can stand being read slowly." Silence. Then Hank, in the back, gave a single clap. Just one. And then more people followed slowly, until the hall was applauding not effusively, but with the specific warmth of those recognizing something true. Arthur sat down. Martha, beside him, placed her hand on his knee without saying a word. That night back at the farm, Arthur went to the office alone. He opened the bottom drawer where he had kept the brown envelope with the date written on the outside. He took out the envelope, looked at it for a moment. Then he went to the porch, sat down and held the envelope in his hand, gazing at the crops in the dark. Martha came after a while and sat beside him. "What are you doing with that?" "Thinking about what to do with it." "Keep it." "What for? The case is over." "Because someday you'll tell this story to some grandchild who's about to sign something without reading it, and you'll be able to show that it was a paper inside an envelope like this that made the difference." She paused. "Stories sometimes need proof." Arthur looked at the envelope. "You're wise, Martha." "I know," she said simply. "But you never stop being surprised by it." He laughed, a light, genuine laugh that came from a place deeper than the week's fatigue. He tucked the envelope back into his overalls pocket, and the two of them stood there on the porch, with the sound of crickets and the smell of earth and the wind that stirred the fields in the dark, looking out at the property that had always been theirs and always would be, because there came a day when Arthur Harrison put on his glasses, turned on the light, and read 42 pages to the end. The end. Tell us what you thought of this story and where you're watching us from. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today.